evening, everyone. I see many participants already. We've gotten an overwhelming response for this event. Almost 2,000 registrations. Hope a lot of people will tune in to this event. And so let's start. I am deeply honored to have Dr. Manish Gupta here with us to enlighten all of us today in this third edition of ShareChat GTL. Dr. Manish, he does not need any introduction, but I'll do a customary introduction anyway. So he's currently the director of Google Research India, and previously he's been leading research labs for Xerox and for IBM, where I had the good fortune of working under his leadership at IBM. He's also been an entrepreneur. Just before joining Google, he co-founded and he was leading a startup called VideoKim. Manish holds a PhD in computer science from UIUC. He's been a prolific researcher himself, and he has over 75 papers and a lot of patents and numerous awards through his illustrious career. He's a distinguished alumnus awardee from IIT Delhi. So pleasure to have you, Manish, today.
Thanks, Devdut, for the kind introduction, and thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. So, Manish, what we'll do today is we'll start off with your personal journey, if you can walk through in your own words, right? As I mentioned, a lot of people in this audience and researchers across India idolize you. So it would be great if we can hear a few stories about you growing up, knowing you better as a person before we get to the topic for the day of building research culture. So
okay, so I don't know about the idealization part, but yeah, let me start with maybe my school. So I went to a school called Sardar Patel Vidyalaya in Delhi, right from nursery until 12th. I loved the school. What I loved the most, I think, one thing that has stayed with me, and I think it's true for a lot of people who went to that school, is the music. We had this Hindi teacher, Dr. Kamal Satyarthi, who had written a wonderful set of poems and songs, and they were composed by, again, the music teacher, Uma Bhai. Unfortunately, both of them are no longer around. And at the end of the assembly, there used to be, the entire school used to sing a particular song. I mean, by rotation, these songs were chosen. And I remember one of those songs that we used to all sing together. And the words of that song were, the last few words were, Chalo na mitte pad chinho par, apne raste aap banao, apne raste aap banao. So basically, for those of you who don't understand English, Hindi, don't follow in somebody else's footsteps, create your own pathways. So, so as a researcher, I think I found that those lines to be very inspiring, and I would convey the same advice, right, to people in the audience. It's fine to listen to me, but ultimately you should do what makes sense for you, right? Create your own pathways. Don't whatever say, oh, you have to follow whatever Manish or anybody else, right? For that matter, create your own pathways.
Absolutely. And by the way, Manish is a great singer too. We heard Manish. I still recall your singing "Phoolon Ke Rang Se" at IRR events. So yeah. So you went to IIT Delhi after school. So if you can talk about the IIT Delhi days.
Sure. So IIT Delhi, if I start with kind of the beginning, I mean, so people from my kind of era, yeah, they would relate to it, but the younger people may find it very surprising that when I opted for computer science, I'd never seen a computer. until that time, right? So today in this pro-reforms India, as well as, I mean, with computers really becoming, computing pretty much affecting every part, right, of how the world is run today, you may find it very kind of surprising, but computers were not at all around, right? So that was kind of just an interesting, and so how did I choose computer science? Well, there's a Hindi word again, bidchal, right? You just follow whatever somebody else is saying. Now there are various kind of ways in which we kind of glamorize those concepts, right? Wisdom of the crowds, crowdsourcing, or collaborative filtering. But again, that's how we made those decisions. And again, I mean, IITs was a really, I would say, fun experience. Still, all of these friends that you made, both kind of within the department, within the hostel, so many of them, again, we are still very close to each other. I mean, still in close touch with many of them. So again, it was quite an amazing experience.
Surely. And then you went to grad school at UIUC. So wanted to understand what motivated you to do a PhD, right? Like as you finished your undergrad, were you already very clear that you wanted to pursue a career in research?
So yeah, I mean, that's actually an interesting story. I mean, I was still in two minds because I'd actually done my master's first at Ohio State, and I'd gotten an admission from Illinois, but also because at that time I was thinking that I would like to just work in the US for a few years and then come back to India. So I also applied for a job, and I got a job from a up and coming company in those days called Microsoft. And I remember I used to come to India every year for winter vacation. So I was back in India talking to my parents. I was telling them, look, you really want me to come back early, so then I should take this job. But the problem is that once I take up this job, I won't be able to come next summer when my sister was getting married. My mom said, what? I mean, how can you miss your sister's wedding? Because in those days, I mean, if you were on an H1 visa, there wasn't that dual intent, right? So you would pretty much be stuck then in India. You wouldn't be able to go back. And my mom said, no way. So she said, what's the alternative? I said, the alternative is, yeah, I could go for this PhD. And she said, yeah, decision is made, go for the PhD. And deep inside, actually, I was happy because, I mean, during my master's, I mean, having done a class project that resulted in a publication, kind of, I tasted kind of what research feels like. So it was kind of fun. And later on, again, one of my classmates who in fact joined Microsoft, and he told me, look, Manish, you missed out on so much money, right? Because I mean, those were the days when Microsoft was just like stock was just grew like crazy. So yeah, he tells me, look, you missed out on a lot of money, but I'm still happy that I chose research as a career.
Yeah, and I'm assuming during your PhD days is when you truly got into research and understood the value of it. So if you can like walk us through that journey as well.
Yeah, so I mean, research is a very interesting kind of the thing about research is you're always working on kind of typically open problems, right? Which either don't have a solution or there are solutions but are not very satisfactory, right? So you're trying to come up with much better solutions. So to be honest, initially it was a bit daunting, right? Because I mean, when you embark on a PhD, you're supposed to come up with some original piece of work. And there's always that question, look, what if I'm unable to come up with anything new, anything creative? But then I guess through the journey of PhD, you realize that there's something special about the human mind, right? When faced with a given problem, each one of us, right, has that ability to come up with something new, something creative. And again, PhD gives you kind of a fairly systematic way, right, where you do that exploration. And of course, it's a very kind of a non-linear, non-steady process, right? There are days where you're stuck and you're not making any progress. So sometimes you get frustrated that look, and sometimes, yeah, you think you've done a great piece of work, you submit that paper and you get that rejection. So those are also very frustrating. But I think it's more than made up, right? For the joy you get, right? When you taste that kind of, when you see that solution to a problem that you've just solved, which is better than anything at least anybody has done on that specific problem. So it's a great feeling. So yeah, all in all, I would say it was a very enriching experience, and at least, I mean, it also increased my confidence. I mean, I feel that PhD kind of A, teaches you to become very systematic about solving these problems in a deep manner, and B, they give you that confidence that look, I mean, no matter what, when faced with a particular problem, when faced with a challenge, right, I would be able to come up with something reasonable.
Sure. And you joined IBM immediately after your PhD. So if you can talk through that decision, because that's a very crucial decision as like every PhD student faces, right?
Sure.
And how much were you drawn to the academia and how much like to the industry, and how did that decision unfold for you?
Sure. So again, I had applied both to academia as well as industry. And the thing that really attracted me to IBM research was, so in my area, so I was working on compilers for supercomputers. And in the area of parallelizing compilers, one is there were like a couple of academic groups which were very well known, the group at Illinois itself, as well as there was a group led by Ken Kennedy at Rice University. But then, I mean, the IBM PTRAN parallel translator group, I mean, that was pretty much considered almost like the best, right? I mean, maybe I'm biased, but it was really at the cutting edge. It was a leader in its area. I'd had again an opportunity to do an internship with them. I'd written to this person, Ron Citron, who was again a very well-known researcher, sent him an email, and he right away responded and said, okay, come on over, right, for the internship. And the group was led by Fran Allen, who was again a very well-known researcher. She was the first woman who was an IBM fellow at that time. And many years later, she became the first woman to win a Turing Award, right, which you know is the highest award in computing. So it was a very, very kind of a special, very well-recognized group. So that was a huge attraction to me, right? To be able to join that group was like a dream come true. And in fact, I remember IBM was in pretty bad shape financially that time. So one of my professors, in fact, warned me, said, why are you joining IBM? The company may not exist in another few years. I said, but this group is so good. And I remember many, many years later, when I, in fact, became the director of IBM Research, I went for this new director's orientation. The then CFO was talking about those days. And I realized, I mean, he was talking how close IBM came to pretty much like running out of business, right? Running out of cash. So I realized that professor was right, but thankfully it worked out well. And yeah, it was again, a really enjoyable 20 years that I spent with IBM Research.
Yeah. Talk through some experiences maybe so you were involved in the Blue Gene project, which was awarded by Barack Obama himself. So maybe about that project or a few other sort of stories that you
Sure.
share.
So Blue Gene, I'll give you maybe an initial story and kind of maybe towards the kind of maturity of the project. So in fact, the project began in kind of late 1999. And in fact, IBM announced the whole project with great fanfare before even the team to build that machine had been constituted. And in fact, initially, I didn't really join that project. I was I was doing my own work on compilers and so on. And about a year later, it was, I think, December of 2000. Again, I was on my usual vacation in India. and I got a call from my manager. And he said, Manish, I have to tell you something. Mark Sneer. So Mark Sneer used to be my manager previously, and Mark Sneer had been leading the system software effort for the Blue Gene project. So he said, oh, Mark Sneer is going to leave IBM. So I said, what? So who's going to lead the Blue Gene software? He said, you. And I couldn't sleep that night because, I mean, I said, there's no way that I'm qualified, that I'm going to be able to really make this project really work. Because as it is, it was a very challenging project, right? So we were going to build the world's fastest machine. It was going to have a total of 128K processors, right? Over 130,000 processors. And the usual experience in those days with parallel computing was that beyond 2000 processors, it was very hard to make a single parallel application scale and exploit so many processors, such high degrees of parallelism. And we had to now, instead of just 1 or 2000, we had to scale single applications, right, to over 100,000 processors. So I said, no way, because I was this compiler guy, and suddenly now I was asked to lead the entire system software. And so I couldn't really sleep that night, that look, this is going to be a disaster. But anyways, as I came back and kind of, again, I was surrounded by a very, very smart group of researchers. So it was, again, a pleasure and an honor to lead them. It was a team mostly of very young researchers. We hired a number of people fresh out of grad school. In fact, there were a bunch of people who joined us from Illinois, Cullen Cascavel, George Almasi, and so on. Jose Morera, who was leading the software activity. So we kind of, so one particular, again, maybe part that I would share is that as we started working on it, again, as is very common in such projects, hardware gets delayed. So hardware got delayed in terms of arriving, but we had these kind of milestones. We had a CO milestone that by the end of November, we have to show 1 teraflop performance on that LINPEC benchmark. But more importantly, by the end of October, that was the end of the financial year for the US government, we had to demonstrate some real results on actual hardware, because the initial contract with Lawrence Livermore National Lab was for a 512 node prototype machine. And based on a review of the performance of that machine, they were going to seek further approval for that 64,000 node machine, the full machine. So it was very important that we were able to show real results by the end of October. And hardware had still not arrived. I mean, and I remember there was a review in March, and there were experienced IBM colleagues who were saying, oh, all these goals, right, for CO milestone and so on, are these for comic relief? I mean, there's no way in hell, right, you're going to make any of these milestones. Because they told us, look, often when the first version of hardware chips doesn't work, then you get this hardware, and sometimes it takes you 2 months to boot the operating system and so on. So one of the things we had done is we had done a lot of preparation. We had, so again, there were these two co-op students that we had, extended interns from Brazil. They are both very, very accomplished researchers. They've been winning awards now at University of Washington and Microsoft Research in Redmond. They built this full system simulator for us, so that we were simulating the entire parallel software stack that we were developing on a system simulator before the hardware came. And that turned out to really be very, very helpful, because when the hardware came, the first day we got the operating system working on the first node. The second day we had kind of this message passing library between 2 nodes working. And the by third day, we had all 10 of these parallel benchmarks from this suite called NAS, parallel benchmarks, running correctly. And then we started kind of scaling and so on. And before like October, sometime in October, we met that CEO milestone that people thought there's no way. I mean, you were going to even meet it by the end of November. And we were able to show good results at this review, which again led to approval, right, for the full machine. So and I remember very, very exciting days, right, as we were scaling up the machine, building it up. Can we make it to the #1 machine, right? There used to be this contest, top 500 list that used to come out at supercomputing conference, and you had to, based on the performance on the LINPACK benchmark. And I remember an 8-rack Blue Gene system, which was like 1/8 of the full system that we were planning to build, beating the then current supercomputer Earth simulator in terms of LINPACK performance, again, thanks to my colleagues like John Gunnell, Sid Chatterjee, and so on. So it was, again, a very, very exciting feeling when you saw, again, such great results on that machine. And again, it turned into it became the fastest machine, turned into a real product. So again, and many years later, then we got that honor from then President Barack Obama, the National Medal of Technology and Innovation.
Sure. Thanks so much for sharing the fascinating story. So then, like, you sort of made this decision to move back to India, right? And this was almost like a turning point, right? If I can imagine. And like many people, many researchers today are contemplating that move. Of course, like making this decision, it would be very different now compared to what it was when you made that decision, right? So would like to hear a little bit how this played out and what
Sure.
were some of the drivers for the move for you, right?
I mean, I'd actually been very keen to move back. And in fact, I'd made an attempt in 97 as well. So I'd come to India on an assignment. And again, I was trying to do all this parallelizing compiler work. But all of the people I was working with, once kind of they got trained, they all wanted to move to the US. So it was very hard to keep up in the year 97, right? So then kind of I gave up and went back. But when I moved back to India in 2006, things were very different. I mean, I think people in India, I think after that Y2K, the whole IT services industry had taken off. IBM, it was a great growth phase for IBM because IBM had decided that they were going to really grow their workforce in India. And there was tremendous growth also for IBM. So it turned out to be, I think, an extremely exciting time. And while I had enjoyed all of this work earlier, right, on supercomputers, Blue Gene, and so on, I think when I moved to India, I found the work even kind of more satisfying because here I could see that connection, right, with the real world. Again, at IBM Research Lab India, where you were a colleague as well, I was again surrounded by so many really, really smart people. So it was such a pleasure to be in that environment. And people were working on fascinating kind of concepts. I remember like being fascinated by this spoken web project, right? That these people, Arun Kumar and Nitendra came up with. They were trying to create the equivalent of the World Wide Web using the spoken words and all of these other projects. So, I mean, it was, while it felt like, okay, a big move, it was really, I wouldn't say by any means any kind of a compromise. I really enjoyed and have enjoyed again my stay in India, which is why I'm still here, right, after 15 years after I moved back.
Sure. Any piece of advice for people who are trying to make that decision in 2021?
So one piece of advice I would say is that, look, I mean, if you think professionally, today I think computing is at this point where it's become so powerful, right, that it can help you solve, I mean, at least start working on solutions, right, for any problem, right, that you can think about. And where are the biggest problems? I think the biggest problems are right here. I mean, in our country, when we look at the kind of scale that we have, the kind of challenges that we have, like with this whole multitude of languages that I know your company Devdutt deals with, there are so many fascinating challenges, right, that India has to offer as a market, as a country. So what better place, right, than to be here, right, immersed in this environment, right, and apply computing to make a difference to some of these problems.
Absolutely. We'll come back to this India point a little later in this session. I'll just sort of move forward to your VideoCAN experience, right? And wanted to know what motivated you to start up, right? And any story that you would like to share. In particular, what I would want to understand is how did your background in research help you as an entrepreneur?
So yeah, so again, I mean, I'm more of an accidental entrepreneur. I never thought I would ever kind of start a company. I always thought of myself much more as this typical researcher. But again, I mean, what happened was at Xerox Research, again, we had been working on a number of very, very interesting solutions. There are several solutions that our team had developed. So one, of course, that was developed in that I had commercialized was VideoCAN, where our team had developed this kind of very interesting learning platform, and it had some very unique capabilities when it comes to handling learning videos, right? So in particular, all of these videos. So for instance, when there is a recording, right, let's say of this conversation, right? Anybody watching this recording, right, would not have the patience to go through the entire 1 hour. So what VideoCAN does is it does this automatic indexing of the video. It creates that phrase cloud automatically based on NLP techniques that identifies the key concepts that have been mentioned in the video, and it lets you directly jump to the places where those phrases have been uttered, right, in the video. It also gives you that table of contents. When there are slides, it gives you that table of contents, which tells you just like a textbook, right, where those topics are. So I went and kind of commercialized, at least tried to commercialize VideoCAN. I wasn't, VideoCAN business didn't really take off, right, the way it has taken off, right, for companies like yours. But it's still around. I mean, it's still, in fact, it is being used in indexing of all of the top AI conferences, NeurIPS, ICML, ICLR, all of the recorded talks. They use it. There are a bunch of customers in US and India who use it, learning customers. Yeah, I mean, it didn't the business didn't take off completely, nor was it kind of a failure. I mean, at least at this point, it is a profitable company, which is like making more revenue than. So how was my background as a researcher? I would say it was both good and bad. The good part was that by virtue of like the initial co-founders and so on, right, being these researchers, we had a whole bunch of very unique capabilities underlying kind of our technical solution at VideoCAN, which is still kind of unique to this day. I mean, we got a whole bunch of US patents, but there were also downsides to being a researcher. And I think those downsides became obvious in hindsight. One of the things, I still was thinking much more like a researcher rather than a true entrepreneur. So even in the early days of VideoCAN, I had a research team. There are like some 4 or 5 people who were doing research for the long term of VideoCAN. And what I realized in hindsight was I should have prioritized business development and kind of getting more customers, gaining more revenue and so on, right, over So the short-term revenue, right, should have been prioritized over long-term kind of continued research and growth. Another very interesting feedback I remember from a customer that I was targeting. This customer gave me this very interesting feedback. She said, "Oh, your product does some hard things very well, but it doesn't do a whole bunch of very simple things that are there in competitive products." So that was again, I think, the kind of fallacy or whatever, the downside of being a researcher, because often as a researcher, you're really excited by the hard problems. And some of the simpler problems, you kind of say, oh, these have been solved, right? So you don't pay too much attention to some of the simple problems, but to create a good product, right? I mean, you have to focus on the end user experience, solve that problem, right? Whether it takes whatever those, all those special algorithms that you have, or whether it's just a matter of copying, right? What functionality is already there, right, in the existing products. So you have to do what is right for the end user. So I think I kind of didn't pay enough attention to some of those, at least in early years. So that was also the downside to being a researcher.
Manish, thanks so much for being as candid as ever, as you always are. So we'll move into the segment where we'll talk more around building a research culture in the industry, which is our theme for today. And we'll start off with, so you have started off a couple of research centers from the start, right? Both Xerox and Google, and of course, even at IBM Research, you were pretty much early, and like under your leadership, the lab grew from strength to strength. So if you look at when you're starting off a research center from ground up, right, what are some of the initial challenges, unique challenges in the initial days? And how do you manage to convince business that, hey, starting off a research center is actually a great idea?
Sure. So let me first just admit that no, I mean, Google, yes, I can claim that, yes, we pretty much started from scratch because there was just me and one more researcher who got hired. Xerox, there was already a team of about 30 researchers. And at IBM, yeah, I mean, IBM already had over 100 researchers when I got there. And in fact, IBM was celebrating its 10th anniversary, the research lab. But I think one early thing which is very important is to really influence and kind of A, connect with the researchers, and B, set the right culture. So I think one of the things I tried to do both at IBM and at Xerox was to really emphasize the importance of deep scientific research, because I mean, those were traditional values, but often, right, when you are very driven by, in a corporate environment, you have to be also driven by the business needs, right? So what I saw at IBM were two issues. One is there was too much of a tendency, right, for businesses to say, look, this is what you need to focus on. And researchers simply saying, okay, yes, sir, or yes, ma'am, right? This is what you want, this is what we'll do. And the business normally, right? I mean, they are not too bothered about publications and all of those things and so on, right? They just want their results. And you can't blame them. I mean, they are right in their expectations. So one of the things that I really emphasize is that in the long run, you're doing much better, delivering much better value to the business if you are focused on scientific excellence, because the business doesn't care about all those conference publications and so on. So because what happens is otherwise there's often a tendency to take shortcuts, right? There's a business problem, you need to often, right, there's a desire to quickly come out with a product, right, with those features and ship it. And in the process, you end up taking shortcuts. So I saw again many parts of IBM research over the years, right, falling into this trap that you're just taking shortcuts and not really worried too much about scientific excellence and so on. And in the process, what ends up happening is you, I mean, start becoming, I mean, just becomes a Me Too kind of a product, right? Often there are competitors who overtake you. Whereas if you really say, okay, I want to solve this problem in a very principled manner, and you also have this target that, look, I mean, go and publish that work in a top tier conference. So that top tier conference isn't going to just accept, right, any junk that you throw at it. I mean, not that they'll always accept good quality papers, but they certainly typically will not accept kind of just a routine kind of an implementation. So you're just forced to up your game. You're forced to, I mean, again, when you are the creativity of the human mind, right? I mean, and also when researchers are also driven not just by kind of doing the right thing for the company, when they also see that personal kind of that fame that comes from presenting that paper, that recognition that comes and so on. We are all humans. It drives us to do things, right, that we would otherwise hate doing. It drives us to like spend overnight, right, working on that, running that experiment to meet that conference paper deadline and so on. So even though it looks like an overhead that you are going to be spending all this time writing up papers and so on, I think in the long run, it ends up improving the quality of your work. And as long as you're still focused on the business outcome, you end up delivering a far superior product feature, far superior product capability. So, and I've literally saw that firsthand from my early days as a compiler researcher. I remember once when I kind of had implemented a compiler optimization, and then I said, okay, let me write a paper on it. And I started writing the paper. I said, I realized I had implemented that thing in a very ad hoc manner, and I couldn't present that ad hoc algorithm in the paper. So I started thinking about it, and I came up with a more kind of a elegant, I mean, a more comprehensive algorithm. And then I went back and changed my implementation, which became far better just by the very act of writing that paper. So I have that strong conviction, right, that focus on scientific excellence really helps you do higher quality work and ends up with better even business outcomes. So that was one key learning I just wanted to share.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've all learned the art of balancing scientific impact and business impact from you, and the focus on scientific impact and how important that is for the long-term success of not just the research lab, but also the company. Right. So along those lines, my next question is, how do you pick bets at a lab level, right? How do you pick bets on research areas, and what in your mind makes a healthy portfolio of problems for a lab?
So you really hit the nail on the head, right? When you talked about the portfolio, healthy portfolio. So I think it's very useful to take that portfolio-based approach, because you want certain parts of the lab, let's say you're leading a research team, you want certain parts of the research to work on very closely with the business group on their priorities, right? On their short-term priorities. Because that's a way to be grounded in the real world. And also it kind of earns you that relationship, that credibility, and that confidence, right, of the business group, that later when you come up with a great idea, they'll be there, right, to be partners with you, right, and commercialize those ideas. So I think one part, it's always good to really kind of work very closely with business groups, and often these have to be very short-term deliverables. So I know at IBM we used to have this term Horizon 1, Horizon 2, Horizon 3. So these are often Horizon 1 or Horizon 2 projects, right? Because often the business group says, okay, here's a capability that we would love to implement. And yes, it would take maybe 2 years to really develop that capability, and kind of 2 to 3 years, right, to ship that. So those are Horizon 2. And it's very important to also have those Horizon 3 projects, right, that typically the businesses couldn't care. I mean, not just couldn't care less about, they would often frown. Why are you wasting our money on these speculative kind of efforts? So there, I think it's very important to pick a few big bets where you're not going to see any business value in the next 2 to 3 years, right? You can't count on any business value, but you should pick those bets such that if you are successful, you succeed big time, right? It shouldn't be, something very incremental, right? If you succeed, you improve whatever your performance by a few percent. No, it has to be then make a substantial difference if you succeed. And yes, it's fine for there to be a significant risk of failure, because what I feel is in a research lab, if we are succeeding all the time, it means we are not doing our job well, right? It means we are not taking enough risk. So it's very important to have at least a certain set of projects where you are kind of not driven necessarily by any real product consideration, but just advancing kind of the foundational kind of technologies, and it could be either for the scientific aspect or it could be to create new products. So it helps to have also work in these buckets and some kind of a balanced portfolio. But the other non-obvious thing that I would say, so this has become, I think, quite well established, well accepted as a good way to run a research lab. But one advice that I also wanted to convey to especially the young researchers in the audience is you should likewise do some kind of a portfolio-based approach in the temporal dimension. And what I mean is, it's fine sometimes in your career, right, to work on very short-term, short things. Okay, I'm going to work on this particular problem where I know I have the expertise. I work on it and kind of make a difference and then move to the next problem. It's fine to be in that mode sometimes during your career, but at least once, and preferably more than once, I feel it is very important for you to work on something that you think is impossible, that you think, oh, this is beyond my capability. I mean, in my case, that was thrust upon me, this whole Blue Gene project. But it's good for you to choose that yourself, right? Work on something very, very ambitious that the world thinks is impossible, that you think is beyond your capability. Because when you're working on these very, very ambitious things, that's when your rate of learning is the highest. Because when the delta between your current state and future state, desired state, right, is huge, you're just forced to kind of learn, right, at a much steeper rate. So that's one reason. The other reason is, if you succeed, I mean, human brain is very, very, we humans, right, all of us have this capability to achieve things that we thought we were incapable of achieving. So when you're really pushed, when you really push yourself to achieve that impossible, sometimes you surprise yourself and achieve that impossible, right? And when you achieve that, it gives you far greater sense of self-satisfaction, and it gives you far greater recognition than a whole series of incremental advances, right? Because if you spend your entire, let's say, career, or even let's say a 10-year period, always working on problems that you know you can solve and kind of advancing in your career, yes, you will reach a certain point. But if you are taking risks and working on very, very ambitious problems, even if you succeed once, you're likely to end up far higher than if you just went for those series of incremental advances, right? So that's one advice that I always give unsolicited to all the people who come and work with me, all the young. So if there are any of my colleagues kind of who have had the misfortune of working with me, they would say, there goes Manish again. But I always like to give this advice to all of the researchers, at least, especially the young researchers.
Yes, Manish, so you almost answered my next question, which was going to be like when you're hiring, and we have a large audience today of young researchers who are looking to build a career in research, right? So my question was that how would you look for that ideal candidate, right? And but you already gave a lot of pointers on that. But if there are a few more things that you want to highlight on that.
Yeah. So one thing that one of the things that we try to do is so first of all, I'm a huge fan and believer in young researchers, right? People whose mind has not been polluted by all the established conventional wisdom and so on, because they are always often right really creative, and they come with a lot of energy. So one of the things that I take credit for is at IBM Research, I started this Blue Scholar program. Then I replicated it at Xerox, called it Budding Scientist program. And then I replicated it at Google Research, right? We call it the Pre-Doc Researcher program. So I've always relied very heavily on these kinds of programs to attract people who don't have a formal research training. So people right after their usually undergrad, we also take master's students, master's graduates, and there we primarily look for again that spark, right? That creativity, that spark, and that drive. Of course, when it comes to research scientist kind of roles, right, where we require PhDs, yes, we look for the quality of their publications. We try to make our own judgment call from the presentation that they give about their research. And again, we look for a combination of their original kind of research capabilities as well as their drive. I'm usually much less interested in an exact match between kind of their expertise and what the job needs, because I feel technology keeps changing. In any case, you have to keep learning new things. So if you hire the right people, they will pick up the expertise, right, that's needed for the job. So I really go more for that intrinsic, some of these intrinsic capabilities and that drive while recruiting.
Sure, absolutely. We have 10 more minutes, so I want to get into the audience questions. But before that, one last question I wanted to cover is very recently also at Google, you've been engaged in AI for social good as a theme, right? So wanted to hear from you about interesting examples that you would like to share, as well as how is it like we already talked about how to convince business, right? And how to trade off between long-term and short-term business impact. And when you're convincing the business about supporting research with a view on having a societal impact, it's even harder, right? So wondering how you would tackle some of those hurdles to support research for social good.
Sure. So the nice thing here is, in this case, I didn't need to convince the business. In fact, I talked about two people. So when Google hired me to start the new research lab, they also hired a very distinguished researcher, Milind Tambe, who's a professor at Harvard, in a joint appointment to lead the AI for social good program, right, for us. So when Milind and I got started, I mean, there was no other researchers around. So Milind had this brilliant idea. So right after joining, he ran this workshop where we invited a whole bunch of NGOs, nonprofits, and a whole bunch of academic researchers. And we simply did matchmaking. We asked the NGOs to specify problems where AI could be applied to make a difference, and we paired them up with academic groups. So we started 6 projects that way. And by the way, this year, Milind said, okay, 6 is too few. So this year we have actually started 30 new projects, this time covering not just India, but also parts of Africa, Southeast Asia. And in fact, this time we have researchers also from the US, Australia, all over the globe, apart from India, of course, joining these efforts. So just to give you one example, where we have been kind of growing our relationship with this nonprofit and people that I really admire is this NGO called Arman, co-founded by, again, one of the co-founders is Dr. Aparna Hegde. So what she herself is a doctor, and from her experience during her residency, she kind of started this NGO to improve maternal health. Especially, she shared some very sobering statistics that in India, there's a woman in today's day and age, there's a woman who dies in childbirth every 15 minutes. There are 2 children under the age of 5 who die in India every 5 minutes. I was shocked. I mean, you don't realize you have these problems. So what Aparna and her team did was very simple things. So they have these voice messages that get delivered over the phone. So they enroll expecting mothers into this program called Mitra. And every week of the pregnancy, there are a couple of messages that get delivered. And a message could be, oh, you're in this particular week. It's very important for you to take an iron tablet so that you reduce your risk of anemia. Or, oh, now your child, and then also during the first year after the child's birth, your child is now 3 months old. Please make sure you enroll in this particular government program and take your child for this particular vaccination and so on. And women who stick with this program, they have showed through randomized controlled trials that they have better outcomes for themselves and their babies. But many women, for various reasons, end up dropping out of that program. So Milan is an expert, and they said, look, we have a few human volunteers who call up these women, but we are enrolling, like, say, if we are enrolling 25,000 women, right, in a given week, we can only barely reach maybe of the order of 500 women who are human volunteers. So which are those 500 women, right? We should prioritize for the human volunteers to reach. So Milan, again, and his team developed these algorithms, based on restless multi-armed bandits, to see, okay, looking at, again, on these transition probabilities, there's something called a Whittle index that you try to compute and so on. And there are challenges because you don't know the transition probabilities of some of these bad to good state, kind of what's the probability of a woman going from about to drop out to staying in that program. So with this, again, our team has developed these models, and we recently ran a trial with 23,000 participants, and we showed, again, through this randomized controlled trials, that you could actually cut down the disengagement levels, right, by a factor of 2, which was, again, a huge kind of a win, because that is going to now result in so many more kind of hopefully save lives and better health for the mothers and their babies. And we are excited about both scaling it to eventually kind of millions of women, which is where Arman wants to go, but also start working on new problems like child malnourishment and others.
That's really and truly inspiring. So we'll get into audience questions, and I'll call upon Ramit to have the audience questions. Ramit, can you share the
Yeah, so indeed, it's right that research is a costly affair. I would say not investing in research is even costlier, because in my view, in the long run, right, it ends up costing your company its business, because at some point you become obsolete, you get overtaken by competitors and so on. So I feel so part of, again, I think the environment which has been changing in India, and it's great that you guys are hosting, right, an entire chat on this particular topic. I think people are in companies in India are recognizing that yes, research can be a powerful differentiator. You can choose to have the right portfolio, right? Whatever you are comfortable with. It's perfectly fine for you as a company, right, to initially prioritize, let's say, short-term research that really results in tangible business results. So it is quite possible, right, for you to do that. But as you become kind of, your business becomes more stable, I think it's very healthy to invest a part of your profit into these very long-term things, because yes, it's speculative, you can fail, but if you succeed big time, right? So I think this is another thing about the Indian culture. For far too long, right, we have been very risk averse as individuals, as businesses. But again, I see that landscape changing, right? Thanks to especially startups like yours. So all of these unicorns, right, and all of these co-founders who are not afraid to fail, right, are showing the way. So I'm hoping that many of these companies will likewise not be afraid of failures from long-term research, and also invest, right, as and when kind of their business permits that. So one of the things, again, the environment is really improving, right? So I mean, there are a lot of research labs that are looking for such people. So in addition to hiring kind of PhDs, right, who are already kind of accomplished researchers, most research labs also hire people who haven't had that research training, because they are extremely kind of valuable colleagues, right, in helping you get things done. So that can be a very valuable kind of an experience for you to work together with other experienced researchers, work on real world problems, and kind of make progress in your journey. There are also a lot of academic groups, right, which are always looking for PhD students, right? So you can choose to also then enroll in a PhD program. And yes, you wouldn't make whatever as much money as you're making in industry, but think of it again as an investment into your future, right? Because you're again getting that opportunity to kind of indulge in deep research activity, and which is going to prepare you, right, from a very, very hopefully fulfilling and meaningful research career. So do not be afraid, right, to kind of go away from whatever path you were on, if research is of interest to you, and take one of these opportunities. And I would certainly expect that with people like Devdut, right, running things, I'm sure ShareChat has a bunch of, even if you don't formally call it a research lab, I'm sure you're dealing with so many challenges, which is why I'm sure, which attracted, right, a smart person like you, Ramit. I've seen, right, the kind of publications that you have. I don't think I had that many publications, even like many years after my PhD. So kudos, right, for what you have already accomplished. So it's great to see people like you, right, in organizations like ShareChat, and I'm sure you're working on very, very interesting and challenging problems, right, and making a difference. So I think today's India is very different. I think there's no shortage of opportunities to do these, to work on these interesting unsolved problems. Yeah, no, that's a that's $1 million question. I do not think, Ramit, there's a single good answer. Like all, so you may say I'm punting, but like all like non-trivial questions, the answer is it depends. So I think it is important not to give up too soon. So I think it's very, very important to, as you encounter these initial kind of failures, to persist, try out alternative solutions and so on. And sometimes you even need to park that problem and say, okay, let me go and work on something else. Because sometimes it's just that you're getting too tense thinking about that particular problem, and it helps to take your mind off that particular problem and start working on something else, because the mind keeps unconsciously sometimes working on those original problems, and many days later and many weeks or many months later, you may have that aha experience, right, and come up with some interesting idea, right, on that original problem that you gave up on. So I think it's good not to give up very early, but at certain point, you also need to be kind of cognizant, right, of kind of the opportunity cost, and perhaps say, okay, let me park this for now, right, and move to something else. And sometimes, right, because if nothing else, sometimes being able to make progress on that other problem gives you again that confidence, builds that energy and that confidence and so on, right? To be able to at some point go back to that tough problem. And sometimes you just need to, sometimes there are others, right, who come up with better solutions, and you have to just accept that, look, you don't need to succeed always.